Welcome to our program tonight, a Charlie Rose special edition. In the 11th episode of our brain series, we look at the deciding brain.
Neuroscience is capable of giving us insights into phenomena that we would not think would be in the corpus of neuroscience, like morality and economic decision-making.
So this is bridging humanity and science.
It's bridging the two things, and this is the beginning. We now have some methodologies, we have some strategies, we have some beginning insight. This is just opening up. So I think this is going to make a major impact on how people make decisions, about how we influence people to make appropriate decisions, and also for making new kinds of diagnoses and developing new kinds of therapeutics.
The 11th episode of the Charlie Rose Brain Series, underwritten by the Simons Foundation, coming up.
From our studios in New York, this is a special edition of Charlie Rose.
This evening, we continue our exploration of the most fascinating topic in science, the human brain. Tonight's subject is decision-making. From simple decisions such as what to wear to complex decisions such as whom to marry, the brain is constantly making choices. But choosing wisely is not easy. Tonight, we will examine why and how the brain is prone to error and irrationality. For example, we sometimes pursue short-term pleasure at the expense of our health. We sometimes crack under pressure instead of rising to the occasion. We also struggle to make the right moral decisions in the face of uncertainty. Researchers today are trying to explain these discrepancies by unraveling the biology of the brain. They're exploring how decisions are made at the level of the individual neuron. They've also isolated the brain regions that control our thoughts and feelings. Our discussion tonight will touch on some of the most important aspects of the human experience, including morality, social interaction, and economic decision-making. We will learn how emotions exert powerful control over our choices, for better or for worse. We'll also learn how decision-making is disrupted in disorders like attention deficit disorder and psychopathic behavior. Joining me now is a group of neuroscientists who approach the mystery of decision-making from very different directions. William Newsom, he studies decision-making on the cellular level by exploring the neural processes that mediate visual perception. He is a professor in the Department of Neurobiology at Stanford University and a Howard Hughes medical investigator. Tony Mofson, he studies the brain systems that control the simplest form of decision-making, perception. He is a professor of neuroscience and psychology at New York University. Ray Dolan, he studies how emotion and cognition interact to produce a decision. He is a professor at University College in London and the director of the Wellcome Trust Center of Neuroimaging. Joshua Green, he studies the brain mechanisms responsible for moral decision-making. He is an assistant professor of psychology at Harvard University and director of the Moral Cognition Lab. And once again, my co-host is Dr. Eric Kandel. He is a Nobel laureate, a professor at Columbia University, a Howard Hughes medical investigator, and a great friend to this program. We begin our discussion asking Dr. Kandel what neuroscience can tell us about decision-making.
Decision-making brings us into a new area of neuroscience. In the past, we've considered how different parts of the brain control different aspects of our behavior. Today, we're going to examine how neuroscience has impacts on other areas of knowledge. Neuroscience is a font of knowledge for other areas of scholarship. This is very important, and its importance was first raised maybe 60 years ago by a famous physicist by the name of C.P. Snow, who wrote a famous essay called Two Cultures, in which he pointed out that a major schism is emerging between the humanities concerned with the nature of human existence and the sciences concerned with the nature of the natural world. This schism, this separation, was based upon the fact that these disciplines distrust one another and fail to understand one another very well. And to some degree, the failure to understand is unidirectional, because scientists have no difficulty enjoying Shakespeare or Picasso, while humanists have a great deal of difficulty understanding quantum mechanics or even brain science. And C.P. Snow suggested that it's important to bridge between these two cultures. And there are a number of bridges that have been built. One is what you do, trying to educate the public about various aspects of science. But as we've seen in the last 10 programs, one of the things that's emerging is that brain science is in fact giving us insights into the nature of human existence. And therefore it's in a position to initiate dialogue with various aspects of the humanities, with economics, with philosophy, with moral decision-making, with art, and with literature. And decision-making in economics and moral philosophy is one area in which neuroscience has made the most substantial progress. It's fair to say that this is probably the most rigorous of the bridging areas that's evolving so far. So we want to use this as an example for studying how neuroscience can impact in other disciplines. Decision-making has many aspects on it. It goes from very simple perceptual decisions to personal decisions, to social decisions, to economic decisions, and moral decisions. Let me give you an example. Very simple to speak about a personal decision. I can decide I'm going to have dinner tonight at 7:30. I can also elaborate this into a social decision. Will I have dinner by myself, or will I have dinner with my colleagues around this round table? This turns into an economic decision. Will I invite people to a very elegant restaurant, which may be expensive, or will I invite them to a pizzeria around the corner? And finally, it brings out a moral decision. Am I, as the co-host of this program, going to pick up the tab, or am I going to ask the leader of this group to pick up the tab? And as you know, in the past, you've always picked up the tab, and I hope you will again tonight. So anyway, there are a range of phenomena. And we have a very good science for approaching it. And the science dates back to the development of several methodologies about 50 years ago. Two different approaches began to develop a science of decision-making. One was trying to pick up signals out of noise. Bell Telephone Company, for example, people working in the Bell Labs were trying to develop methods whereby in a noisy telephone line, you could amplify the signal so you could tell the difference between pole and bowl, two very similar sounding words. And so to pick the signal out of the noise was a task they set themselves. Another group of people was also focusing on picking the signal out of noise, and that was mathematicians trying to develop statistical methods to determine whether a particular scientific finding is reliable or just a signal in the noise. It turned out that the approaches of both of these groups turned out to be very similar, and provided an opportunity to really begin to approach these problems in a very systematic way, and to study this in a biological sense. And the biology that has emerged of it is quite fascinating, because even though we're dealing with a variety of different processes, perceptual, personal, social, economic, moral, it turns out that a number of key brain areas are involved in all of these. Now, the fact that brain areas involved in perception, in personal decisions, is easy to understand. But to think that moral decisions involve the brain is a bit of a stretch. And we want to begin by asking, what is the evidence that moral functions are represented in the brain? And that dates to a very famous case, a man called Phineas Gage, who in about 1848 was working on a railroad and working with explosives, and in the course of working this with steel poles, a steel pole went through his skull from the base here, coming out at the tip of the skull, damaged his brain very seriously. This physician, John Harlow, a relatively inexperienced physician, took excellent care of him, paying a lot of attention to him, making sure that he really recovers from this. And he recovered to the most amazing degree. Within days, he was able to walk and talk and function effectively. Within a few weeks, he was back in the job. But the amazing thing is that despite the fact that he was doing all of these routine things well, he had changed in the most dramatic way. People said, Gage is no longer Gage. Before this accident, he was the foreman of the crew. He was absolutely reliable. He was like you. You could always count on him to do the job and to do it well. After the accident, he was completely irresponsible. He never showed up on time. He became obscene. He paid no attention to his fellow people. He had really lost a sense of moral judgment. And this was absolutely remarkable. Now, at the time he died, they didn't do an autopsy on him. Harlow presented two major papers, which are illustrated in this book. But Hanna and Tony Damasio came back many, many years later, and using the skull and this steel pole that went over him, they reconstructed the pathway of this lesion and realized that one important structure that was damaged by it was the prefrontal cortex, and particularly the undersurface, what is called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex. And we now know from a number of people's work, and we'll discuss this today, that these structures are extremely important for moral behavior, for decision making. And the Damasios and others, and Ray Dolan had a contribution here as well, realized that these prefrontal cortical areas also exert a control over the amygdala, structure we discussed before, deep in the brain, which orchestrates emotion. And that has made a lot of people, including the Damasios, realize that moral decisions, decision-making, and emotions are often tied together, that you cannot separate one and the other. And we'll hear later on how certain kinds of moral decisions inevitably recruit emotions in a very powerful way. So we're going to have a wonderful time just listening to the various aspects of emotion that we now begin to understand.
All of that from one question. Not bad, huh? Let me just begin with Tony and talk about sort of how a person makes a decision.
As Eric indicated, there's a sort of tradition of decision-making that's based on problems in signal processing and engineering and in statistical decision-making. How do you decide whether one quantity was, in fact, larger than another based on the measurements that you made? And the mathematics and engineering sciences that developed around this gave rise to a set of techniques in psychology which we call signal detection theory. And this, the theory of signal detection allowed people in the 50s and 60s to achieve a very sophisticated understanding of how human observers made simple perceptual decisions. The idea, of course, is that we can generalize those processes to more complex judgments by adding layers on top of them, and we'll talk about those layers as well.
But so the basic difference between simple decisions and difficult decisions or complex decisions is?
Well, a very simple decision might just involve taking the measurement of two things, one brighter than the other.
Right.
You're the question I'm asking you is that one brighter than this one? A more complicated decision will be the kind of decision that Josh will be talking about later on, where you'll be asked to weigh goods and ills and to weigh the costs of things. Yeah. You'll be asked to make decisions in the face of uncertainty, which is a major challenge that all of us face, and you may be asked to make decisions in the face of variable costs and variable penalties for making the wrong decision and the right decision. And so all of those factors become layered upon the simple basic question of, if I measure X and I measure Y, which one is the larger? But at the root, the question is, if I have two measurements and I compare them, can I choose the larger one and get it right?
The wonderful thing about this area is we can not only study it in behavioral terms, but we can also study it in cellular physiological terms. And Bill was one of the people that pioneered the cellular study of decision making.
Right.
We actually got into this a number of years ago. Mike Shadlin, who was working with me in the lab at the time, we realized we had an enormous opportunity perhaps to train animals, experimental animals in the lab, rhesus monkeys in particular, to make simple decisions about sensory stimuli. And we actually had an opportunity to try to identify the circuits in the brain that were involved when the animal actually looked at a TV screen and made a decision of what was there. And this was a big opportunity, but it was also a big risk, you know, that you can chase a complex thing like a decision around the brain and never actually come to grips with it. But as it turned out, we got fortunate, and we were able to identify some circuits in the monkey cerebral cortex that seemed to be highly involved in rendering these decisions. And then we were able to use this as a test bed to bring in more complex sorts of decisions. So more recently in the lab, we've been looking at what we call value-based decisions, not moral values in our case, but economic values. So we can put an animal in a situation where it's a difficult discrimination for the animal, but we can promise him more reward if he chooses the one on the left than if he chooses the one on the right. And if it's difficult and he's not sure which one is correct, he'll go for the bigger reward. So they're very experienced economic foragers. Animals are outstanding economic subjects because their survival depends on impressively good foraging. So we can start mixing layers of complexity in the lab in these animals and get into sort of a subject that is sort of called neuroeconomics, which has been heavily investigated by Paul Glimcher, one of Tony's colleagues at NYU, and by Ray Dolan, who's with us here.
Ray's a psychiatrist, so he's accustomed to complexity.
Yes, you know, it's very interesting hearing Bill, because one of the common things for humans and animals, it seems obvious, is that we care deeply about outcomes. Mm-hmm. And most of our decisions are somehow shaped by the likely outcomes that will ensue. But there's one big difference with humans, which makes the study of humans both difficult but also interesting, is that the range of outcomes we care about are vastly different than animals, and much more abstract. We care about money, we care about art, we care about status. one other thing we care about is we care also about the future. So animals tend to be very bound in the present. We care about the future, and we put a value in the present upon our future states. Hence, we'll save for pensions, or those of us who are not impulsive. So one of the issues that come up in human decision-making is, how do we put all this into some sort of common currency? And it turns out, going back to Phineas Gage again, is that the part of the brain that seems to be important in doing this is the same ventromedial prefrontal cortex that was damaged in Phineas Gage. The interest here, of course, is that you can begin to explain the aberrant behavior seen by psychiatrists, neurologists, in patients who've got brain damage. You can begin to explain it in terms of ideas that come from decision theory and from economics. So we're in a very exciting period of time in terms of how we can unpack not only how people make decisions, but how aberrant behavior might emerge through dysfunction in systems related to decision making.
Where do you come into this?
So I come in as a philosopher with interests in the kinds of decisions that really get under the skin. I think often when we face difficult decisions, we feel that there's a kind of tension between an automatic impulse, a gut reaction on the one hand, and then another voice that feels a little bit cooler, more of the voice of reason, perhaps, although that's a controversial way of describing it. And this idea has been around for a long time. Plato divided the soul up into a passionate part and a more deliberative part. And in the Enlightenment, philosophers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant debated the actual and ideal roles of emotion and reason in moral decision-making. And what we're finding today is that these ideas, which make intuitive sense, but maybe are just stories, aren't really just stories, that the tension that we feel between passion and reason, between intuition and deliberation, really is based on a tension between competing systems in the brain, including some of the systems that Ray mentioned. And so we've actually made some progress in neuroscience by bringing in dilemmas from philosophy, and I hope we've understood the philosophical questions a little bit better by paying attention to the underlying basis in the brain.
Okay. Before we get too far, Eric, I want to make sure I understand what's happening in the neurons in terms of decision making.
In order to study any process in detail, you need a good psychological description of what's going on, and Tony has pioneered in that.
Right.
You then can tackle the problem at the cellular level
Right.
in experimental animals using single-cell recording. And then you can go on, which is a revolution in the last 20 or 30 years, to image it in intact behaving people and ask them what areas of the brain light up when you make a moral judgment, when you make an economic decision. So we need to discuss all of these, the behavior, the cellular recordings of it, and the imaging of people making progressively more complex decisions.
The representation of sensory stimuli in the brain is something that we talked about in an earlier program, and something that people have been familiar with for almost a century now. And the evidence we have on that comes from making brain recordings of the responses that neurons give to sensory signals. And one key thing, it turns out, is that in many different domains, the sensory signals that you measure in a nerve cell get stronger when the stimulus in the world gets stronger. So that means that the activity in a nerve cell gives you a measurement of how intense the stimulus was in the world. That gives you a natural framework for thinking about how you would distinguish between two stimuli that differ in intensity. And so the reasoning being that if one stimulus evokes a stronger response and another evokes a weaker response, then the difference between those two is the decision variable, so-called, on which you're going to base your judgment. Now, it turns out to be handy to have a simple task to do in which one can actually ask either a human observer or a macaque monkey or a neuron, depending on the experiment you're doing, which of two stimuli is the stronger. And some years ago, Bill and I settled on a particular kind of moving stimulus as being handy for this. And I'm going to run an experiment with that stimulus on Eric. What he's going to get is a little countdown, 3, 2, 1, then a bullseye.
I can manage that.
Now watch the dots. And at the end, I'm going to ask you what direction those dots were moving in. Eric, I think you can manage this. Did the dots move left or right? To the left, correct. Now, that task was basically effortless because all the dots moved together and you didn't actually have to do any particular discrimination. But now,
that wasn't that easy.
I'm going to make it a little bit harder in the next video by taking some of the dots and making them twinkle at random instead of move together.
Right.
Yep. You are correct, but you'll notice that some of the dots were not actually obeying that rule.
Getting a little bit more difficult.
Now I'm going to make things a little harder. Which way?
To the right, I think.
All right, Eric.
Very good.
All right.
So,
I think I've got a future at this. Can I become a monkey?
as they say in the films, don't get cocky. We may have the next piece.
Charlie
please.
handles the next one.
No. Next one, please.
Oh, this is hard. To the left.
To the left. You are correct, Eric, but it was hard. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that as I've made this harder by sprinkling all these random dots in it, you haven't been able just to look effortlessly at the display and say, oh, I see it's immediately moving to the left. You have to watch, you have to attend, and you have to do what we call integrate information over the course of the display before you can make up your mind.
Right.
And what makes this task very helpful for us as neuroscientists is that you can actually use that need to integrate over time to make things work. Let me just give you the last hard one, Eric.
I think it's to the right. I'm not sure.
You are correct, but you were guessing. The reason we did this experiment this way is that we knew there were neurons in the brain that responded to the motion and responded more strongly when the motion was strong and more weakly when the motion was weak. And basically what we're doing is asking the neurons that respond for leftward motion and the neurons that respond for rightward motion to argue between themselves about which was basically the better signal, which was the stronger signal.
Right.
And Eric chose in the end of each of these trials, on the basis of the rightward neurons and the leftward neurons, he chose the population of neurons, as we think about them, that gave the strongest signal.
There are two things you can measure about decision making in the laboratory very easily. One is whether you're correct or not, the way we were doing with Eric. And another one that we were not doing with Eric actually is how quickly you make the decision. And those two trade off against each other. So you can actually make more accurate decisions if you wait and integrate the information longer. Or sometimes you're in a premium where you want to make decisions quickly and you'll sacrifice accuracy in order to go quickly. And so what we did, the models, the psychologists have built these models in the past that actually account for the accuracy and speed data. And the notion, if you watch my hands, is that you've got these integrating mechanisms in the brain, one for rightward motion, one for leftward motion, and they start integrating information. And this guy goes up a little bit when he sees evidence for right, and this one comes up a little bit when he sees evidence for left, and they're kind of going like this. And in Eric's case, right wins when it's the rightward stimulus. But if it's a leftward stimulus, the notion is they're both accumulating evidence, and ultimately the left one wins. And so you have these what are called accumulator models. You're accumulating the evidence. And for our animals, it'll be dots like this. But for us, it might be whether we're going to have chicken or beef for dinner this evening, which is going to win when we sit down at the table. And what's the amazing thing is that Mike Shadlin and I and Mike's colleagues and my colleagues have been able to see neurons in the brain that actually seem to reflect this accumulation of information. So their firing rates get stronger. We have a pool of neurons favoring right and a pool of neurons favoring left, and their information actually gets stronger. And by recording from these neurons in real time, while Eric is watching those dots and trying to decide is it right or left, we can actually predict what Eric is going to say or what the monkeys are going to say at the end of the trial. It's like you're almost reading the animal's mind during the interval while they're expecting the dots, and we can actually see these accumulators working in real time and predict what decision the animal's going to make.
You asked about the difference between simple decisions and complex decisions. So a simple decision when all that happens is you have to tell left from right, and at the end of the trial you get a drop of juice if you got it right, and you don't if you don't, is a very simple decision because the costs and the benefits are well known. The benefit is a drop of juice if you get it right, the cost is nothing. But real life decisions have more complicated outcomes, and many times the outcome of a decision is uncertain. You don't know, for example, if you make a particular decision to go forage in that piece of the forest as opposed to this one, whether you're actually going to find fruit or not. So the question is whether the simple decision-making models that people like Bill and I study can actually be made to generalize to situations where the outcomes are uncertain, the costs and benefits are complicated, and there is maybe a set of prior beliefs sitting around about what a good place to go. If I'm looking for oranges, I'm probably not going to go out into the desert or into the water. I'm going to go to where the orange trees are. Right. And so all of these factors become layers that you add onto this basic simple decision process.
Is the process different for economic decisions?
What we've been hearing about are what might be called normative decision-making processes. But when it comes to human decisions, it turns out that humans don't always act in a normative fashion, the way sort of theories prescribe, because we seem to be particularly susceptible to cues in the environment that trigger emotions, and emotions can sometimes benefit the decision process, but sometimes they can corrupt it.
Right.
And this gives rise to a view of the mind not made of one decision-making central executive system, but perhaps multiple decision-making systems, one being the sort of far-sighted decision-making system we've heard about. Another one might be a habitual decision-making system, the type of system that gets you home from work, reading a newspaper without thinking about how you're going home. That's a habit. Or a low-level decision-making system, an emotion, which really corresponds to elicitation of very basic response tendencies associated with reward. You approach things or attract to things, or punishment. You feel you retreat from things. Now, this turns out to be very pervasive in everyday life because it seems to influence and bias how we make decisions. And one example is based upon a very famous experiment done by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. So the task here is that if I give you £50 and say you've got a gamble, and one gamble is you can keep £20, or you take the gamble you see below the £20. Or I could give you another option, which I say you lose the $30 or £30 and you go for the gamble. It turns out they're exactly the same thing, but in one I'm presenting it to you in a positive frame, in the other in a negative frame. And people are vastly different in terms of whether they go for the sure option, the keep, or the gamble, depending upon the frame. And what becomes important then is how pervasive is the effect of the emotional brain upon decisions in general. And one of the things we've learned is that brain chemicals like dopamine seem to be important in controlling the degree to which the emotional brain might influence the more sort of rational brain. And this becomes important when you come to the field of neurology. Take Parkinson's patients. Parkinson's patients are frequently treated with drugs that drive the dopamine system. And this can have the effect that the emotional system will begin to dominate the rational system. And you end up with very tragic situations where patients with Parkinson's disease will engage in compulsive gambling. The immediate attraction of the reward of winning leads them, under the influence of the drugs that they're being treated with, to sometimes spend all of their life savings. I've had a number of patients like this who've managed to literally blow everything they've got by gambling on the internet using a credit card while their wife is in bed thinking everything is quiet in the house. So we're beginning to learn an awful lot about how different systems in the brain interact, what controls their interaction. And I like the analogy that the human mind or brain is not a singular sort of chief executive. It's much more like a parliament. You have a parliament of the mind with much more rational sort of parties, but some more low-level, unreconstructed parties, the emotional system, and the habit system, the old conservative trend. Do things the same way every day.
These problems are so fascinating because the framing problem is so interesting in medicine.
Absolutely. So this may seem a kind of a trivial example, but most of us at some point in our lives will go along to see a physician, and the physician will tell you that you can have this treatment, and you'll generally ask the question, well, what's the likely outcome? If I tell you that this treatment will cure you with 90% probability, I could also say to you, well, there's 10% chance you'll die with the treatment. I'm giving you the same information, but how I frame it will change how you take up the treatment. There have been many experiments like this done which show that how you convey information becomes critically important. And this becomes a public policy issue, social policy. I guess it becomes important when it comes to how you conduct a referendum.
Yeah.
How do you frame the question? Because
All about advertisement, essentially, is how you frame the question.
Indeed.
Many of the lessons that Ray conveyed about economic decision-making also apply to moral decision-making, which comes to people's surprise sometimes, because people often think of moral decisions as being made by a moral sense or a moral faculty that's somehow special and apart from the rest of the mind, but that doesn't seem to be the case. One good place to start to see how the mind is like a fractious parliament rather than a unified monarchy is to start with moral dilemmas. Right. Moral dilemmas are fascinating because they have competing factors, and they're a good place to start if you're trying to do a science of moral decision making, because they can bring out the competing forces which may and do, as it turns out, correspond to competing forces in the mind. So one famous set of moral dilemmas that philosophers have been arguing about for a few decades now is known as the trolley problem. Right. And it comes in a couple of different parts. So in the first part of the trolley problem, and you can see it up at the top of the screen, there's a trolley that's headed towards those 5 people. And there you are down at the bottom by the switch. And the only way you can save the lives of those 5 people is by hitting that switch. And that will divert the trolley away from the 5 and onto the 1. And if you ask people, is it morally acceptable, permissible to hit that switch and minimize the number of deaths? Almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody says yes. And then you give people the second case, which is illustrated at the bottom there. Now, this time, the trolley is headed towards the 5 people. And this time, we'll take a little bit of literary license and say that the only way that you could save those 5 people is to push a large individual, you can see him there hanging over the edge, off of the footbridge, and he'll land on the track, and he'll be killed by the trolley, but it'll save the 5 people. Now, put aside the fact, couldn't you jump yourself? Will the guy really be able to stop a trolley? And just accept this, suspend disbelief for a moment, if you will. Even with that suspension of disbelief, most people say that it's not okay to do that. And so there's an interesting philosophical question, and there's a corresponding interesting set of psychological and neurological questions. The philosophical question is, what's really the right thing to do here? Why should this case be different from this case when they're so similar on the surface? The psychological question is, why do we have such different intuitions about these cases? Why do most people say that it's okay here and not here, when in both cases it's 1 life for 5, death by trolley? What's the difference? And so the initial work that was done on this I did with brain imaging, but I think the strongest evidence for this competing systems idea comes from studies of modern-day patients who have similar damage to Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage, the guy who got the iron spike through his head. These patients have damage to a part of the brain known as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And as we said earlier, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex seems to be very important for integrating emotional signals into decision-making. And so the theory goes something like this. Something about that case where you're pushing that guy off the footbridge in this up-close and personal way, using him as a trolley stopper, so to speak, triggers an emotional response that makes us say, no, I see that there's a rationale for doing this, but that just seems wrong. Whereas in the other case, it doesn't have that same element, and we're willing to treat this more like an accountant and say, well, 1 life, 5 lives, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. Well, if that psychological theory is right, then we might expect those patients like Phineas Gage to make a very different kind of decision. That is, those patients with that emotion-related damage, because of their damage, they don't have the same kinds of emotional signals as other people. Those patients might function more like an accountant in both cases. They'll say 5 lives for 1, that sounds good in the switch case. 5 lives for 1, sure, use the guy as a trolley stopper. And it turns out that when you give these patients those kinds of dilemmas, they are 4 to 5 times more likely than ordinary people to say, push the guy off the footbridge in the name of the greater good. And so what this experiment demonstrates is that there are different kinds of moralities that are embedded in different systems in the brain. You've got, on the one hand, in this case, an emotional system that's saying, no, 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 don't do it. That's kind of like an alarm bell going off. And then there is another system that can look at this and say, well, we want to save the most lives, 5 lives for 1, that sounds like a good deal. In ordinary people, they compete. And in the patients, you see the 2 systems come apart because one is knocked out while the other is still intact. One way to think about this is to think of the mind as being kind of like a camera. It has automatic settings on it, like you can use it to take a quick point-and-shoot landscape or portrait, or you can put the camera in manual mode. And the research program that Tony referred to, known as the Heuristics and Biases Research Program, shows how we have these very useful decision rules that are kind of like using the automatic settings on your camera. They'll do a good job most of the time, but they're not very flexible. And you put it in a slightly different situation, and they misfire. And so what's going on in a lot of these cases, for example, the kind that Ray described, I think, is that there's an automatic system that's applying a heuristic that's generally pretty good, but that at the margins can get us in trouble. And you see this in medical decision making. I would argue, although this is more contentious, that you see it in moral decision making as well. But the framework is certainly common, and a lot of the brain regions that are involved in these kinds of economic decision making, such as the amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, are also, as I said, involved in moral decision making and seem to play a similar computational role.
Is there any systematic study of the biology of psychopathy, of people who are capable of doing just horrendous deeds would not have any difficulty pushing somebody over the bridge?
So there's actually been a lot of research on psychopathy indicates that it is primarily an emotional disorder. That the two defining features of psychopaths are their bad behavior, the antisocial things they do, and their lack of empathy for other people and corresponding lack of remorse for the bad things that they do. And so some people have actually started using these kinds of moral dilemmas with psychopaths. And one of these studies has shown that when people, this is a community sample, but when people with psychopathic tendencies respond to these kinds of dilemmas, particularly the kind like the footbridge case, where you're harming somebody in this more personal sort of direct kind of way, they exhibit decreased activity in the amygdala, which, as Eric said, is one of the regions that orchestrates emotion more widely. I'm currently working on a study with someone named Kent Keel at the University of New Mexico, who drives this mobile MRI machine around to different prisons in New Mexico and scans the brains of incarcerated individuals, many of them psychopaths. And so we're just beginning to look at a cohort of full-blooded psychopaths and to see if we can use moral reasoning as a way to better understand the mind of the psychopath and to use psychopaths to better understand moral reasoning. So there's definitely some traction there, but we're just in early days.
Okay, but even if it's in the early days, what are you learning? I mean, any indications of what you're going to learn?
Well, what I'm hoping is, or I should say, hoping, I'm a dispassionate scientist, of course, but what my theory would predict is that these psychopaths would, in a more subtle way, be like the patients like Phineas Gage, that they don't have an emotional response that says, oh, no, that just feels wrong, and so they're going to, in some sense, be more likely to be what we call utilitarian, that is, willing to say, go with the numbers, one life for five. But we also know that psychopaths are much trickier than these patients with the ventromedial prefrontal damage. They work very hard to seem normal and to blend in. And so to catch them in the act, we're going to have to use a few subtle tricks. We may have to, as Bill suggested, look not only at what they do, but how quickly they do it. And so that's one of the things we're looking at. And you know, Kent is looking at their genes. There's a whole lot going on. But I think that the story may turn out that they are a kind of more subtle version of the Phineas Gage types, but for different reasons.
So there are two issues that sort of arise that I'm curious to have you people address. One is neuroscience is beginning to address issues that concern economists. The major issue, this is what David Brooks emphasized in his discussion with you, is one thinks of people as being rational actors. And what these analyses reveal is there are a lot of irrationality, emotional aspects to it that deviate you from what would be a rational decision.
But it's not necessarily an irrationally computed decision. That's the important. So it may be based on an irrational estimate of outcomes and an irrational estimate of uncertainties. There's a very simple experiment that's often discussed when in the context of uncertainty that Ray mentioned, which is you basically give an individual, it can be a bird, it can be a monkey, it can be a person, a choice between two situations. One in which the bird is guaranteed to get a reward of 6 nuts. Let's say if birds like nuts. I don't know if birds like nuts. And your birds like nuts. And then the other choice that the bird can make is to go someplace where it can forage, and it might get 12 nuts, or it might get no nuts, right? On average, it will get 6 nuts, but only on average. So that's a situation in which the expected outcome statistically over many trials is the same, 6 nuts each. But the chance of getting a big reward is much higher over here, and the chance of losing big is much higher over here. And so the question of which of those you choose is a sort of diagnostic in some sense for the kind of personal style with which you approach decisions.
Let me come back to you, Eric, and say, what's the most valuable thing we're learning from this? In other words, so what?
Well, I think several things. One is that neuroscience is capable of giving us insights into phenomena that we would not think would be in the corpus of neuroscience, like morality and economic decision-making.
So this is bridging humanity and science.
It's bridging the two things. And this is the beginning. We now have some methodologies, we have some strategies, we have some beginning insight. This is just opening up. So I think there's going to make a major impact on how people make decisions, about how we influence people to make appropriate decisions, and also for making new kinds of diagnoses and developing new kinds of therapeutics. For example, if we could diagnose kids early that had a tendency toward psychopathy, because we see a malfunctioning of the prefrontal cortex, it's conceivable we might be able to develop a therapeutic process whereby some other brain region would be encouraged to function to take over those aspects of behavior.
Okay, so but how far away are we from understanding this? If we make a lot of bad decisions, how far are we from learning how to correct that issue so that we make a higher percentage of good decisions?
Gentlemen.
I think that we can get there. But I think, first of all, we have to understand what it is that drives decisions. And we have to understand the neural mechanisms and how they actually interact with each other. I mean, I was having exactly this conversation that you raised with an economist colleague of mine at Stanford recently, and the guy at Stanford is skeptical about the relevance of neuroscience for economics. And he said, you know, all I care is the choices that people make. I just care what happens in the end. I don't care what's going on in the brain to produce the choices. The choices are something I can measure. That's my data. That's what I work with. And I think my counterpoint to him was, you can measure the choices now, but how are you going to predict choices in the future in different situations? And the dominant model in economics right now that's used to explain choice is actually economic rationality. You know, that you choose the thing that actually is the best in the long run in terms of economic outcome. But we know people don't work that way. Kahneman and Tversky, who we've already talked about a little bit, know that we don't work that way. And so the question then is, what are the deeper underlying principles by which decisions get made? And if we can understand those, then we can predict behavior better. I mean, we've just come through a period in this country with disastrous economic decisions having been made. And disastrous kinds of decisions being made at the levels of, you know, do we regulate, do we not regulate, what kinds of instruments are wise to use? And these are deep-rooted decisions that get made in human behavior, and that we need to try to understand where the decisions come from. And the rational model is not going to, in the end, be a very good guide.
I think a simple example of what neuroscience can offer is the realization that we've had from Freud and even before, how important emotion is to people's behavior. And your example, how sometimes emotional processes are recruited and sometimes they're not for decision-making, for moral decision-making. We need a direct measure of that. If we can image people and say, we recruit the amygdala under these circumstances, we don't recruit the amygdala under those circumstances, we have an independent way of evaluating under what circumstances emotional processes recruited. And I think that's extremely important, because otherwise we're just inferring that this is happening. This provides us a direct measurement.
Emotion is something we have a very difficult time studying in animals, actually. I mean, this is much more tractable in humans, one of the things that's much more tractable. And Ray sort of talked about this parliament of decisions and decision-making voices and sort of the higher-level reasoning and this rambunctious, bubbly kind of emotional substrate. And Josh mentioned emotion. And I know, and the question is sort of, is emotion something that's valuable and that we should be keeping, or is emotion sometimes that leads us astray in decision making, and how do you recognize one versus the other? Because sometimes emotions clearly lead us astray, and utilitarian calculus would discount emotion completely and just say it's a numbers game. But sometimes the emotion, the empathy, the ability to empathize with other people that the psychopaths lack is a good thing. How do we think about pluses and minuses of emotion?
So I think this is where I think that the camera analogy is very useful. If you think of the emotions as being like the automatic settings, and you think of manual mode as being like reasoning, you can ask of a photographer, well, what's better, the automatic settings or the manual mode? And what the photographer will say is different things are good for different circumstances. That if you're in a standard kind of photographic situation, the kind that the manufacturer of your camera could anticipate, then go ahead and use your automatic landscape setting or whatever it is. But if you're facing a fundamentally new kind of photographic challenge, then you're probably going to have to put your camera in manual mode. And so I think that what we really need to do as a society is understand ourselves so that we can know how to use our moral brains. Understand when we're dealing with the kind of situation that we've been well prepared for, either by our genes or by cultural influences or by our own experiences, and when we're sort of going out on a decision-making limb. An example of going out on a decision-making limb would be dealing with something like global warming. We have no genetic experience with dealing with global warming. We have no personal experience with it. I mean, we've never gone through a trial and error process because we're still on our first trial, and likewise for cultural ways of honing our decisions. And so in trying to come up with what's a fair way to divide up the burdens of solving this problem, should we go with historical emissions levels and say whatever's been in the past, that's more or less fair and we're going to stick with that? Or should we start with a clean slate and say every human on Earth has the equal right to emit carbon? Very different ways of looking at it. Obviously, different countries favor looking at it one way or the other. And I think our intuitions about justice and fairness may not be much help here. And we may have to put our cameras in manual mode and think like wonky economists. Other cases, for example, managing your personal life, it would be terrible to think like a wonky economist. And instead, you want to think like a poet. Right. So we got to understand ourselves to use our minds better.
There's an important thing not to lose sight of in Josh's trolley example, which I think talks to Bill's question, which is the difference between the two situations in the trolley example is not in the outcomes, as Josh said. The guy who is in front of the trolley is going to die an equally horrible death in both cases. He's going to be run over by the trolley. The difference is your personal involvement with it and the way in which you relate to other people. And so if you want to answer Bill's question in the terms of the trolley problem, the emotional system is the one that regulates your dealings with other humans, not so much regulates your decisions about economic outcomes. I think that's a rather important thing.
It is, but I also think it's important not to think of the emotional system as being monolithic. Right? There are positive emotions and negative emotions, so to fractionate that. And imaging can probably help us dissect that out, and what circumstances they're appropriately recruited, what circumstances they're not.
Emotions are useful depending upon the context. If you have to make a very fast decision, emotions have, we assume, proved very, very helpful through evolution. And sometimes you only can make a decision with the help of emotion. Falling in love and deciding to marry somebody often requires the sort of the vacillation of the rational mind to be sort of trumped by the sort of passion of love. So emotions have their place, and a lot of our richest experience comes through emotions. Just one other comment on the trolley example. I'm trying to unpack it. One of the situations there is a propositional situation. You have never actually had direct experience. The other one, where you push the guy, is much more one where you have had experience. And we don't like pushing people. We're told not to do it, and if we've done it, we've got a blow on the nose from the person we've done it to. So I think those sort of things have probably come into it. The difference between experience and how we the calculus of experience versus the calculus of the sort of more abstract, propositional world that we confront.
Tony and Eric are pretty pushy guys.
Yeah. Well, you didn't give us the choice of pushing each other off. But I actually have a question, which I know is one that Eric thinks about a lot, and which I think bears on this, and I'd sort of like to hear what these guys have to say about it. People can be induced by social situations to make reprehensible decisions, decisions that we now perceive objectively to be reprehensible, and we can all make a long list of hideous things that people have done to other people. And one assumes that under the circumstances in which the decisions were made to take the actions that were taken, those decisions were computed on the basis of some brain system. And a question which I know Eric cares about, and which I care about too, is to know how brain systems that can lead to such outcomes can be shaped by experience, shaped by environment, and how they can be regulated.
It's the framing problem. I mean, how could a civilized society like the German societies of the 1920s become Hitler-dominated, destroying Jews and gypsies in the 1930s and 1940s? And I think the answer to that is the capability for evil is built into our genome. That most people are under certain circumstances capable of doing it. There are exceptions. You obviously must be an exception. The framing of the question, how you structure society, is absolutely essential to this. If you say the Jews are vermin in society, you know, they're parasites, they're destroying German culture, you know, they're subhuman. You have a completely different attitude than saying we're all equals.
I wonder if that's the only answer.
It's not the only answer, but it's certainly part of the answer. There are additional answers. There are opportunistic answers. If you get rid of half the faculty of the Department of Medicine because they're Jewish, young people can move up. So there are lots of people for participating in the system, but the fact is there's a lot of flexibility involved in human behavior.
Neuroscience of decision making is going to be very pressing for our society. Josh and I have been involved for the last 3 years in a neuroscience and law project sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation, because neuroscience evidence is starting more and more to be being introduced into court situations with defense attorneys showing brain scans and saying, look, my client's brain is different from normal brains. How can my client be held responsible for his action when he's got a different brain from the rest of us? And federal judges are looking at psychologists and neuroscientists and saying, what do we do with this stuff? You know, what are the reliability of these data and things? And if we come to think that decision making has very mechanistic, causal sequelae that lead to particular decisions, can people be held reasonably responsible for their decisions? Can any of us be held responsible for our decisions, or are we merely dancing to the tune of atoms and molecules that are dancing in our brains? And I don't think that's the case, but it's a reasonable, it's an argument that can be made, and I think that this is what we decide about this, and what a mature neuroscience has to say about this is going to impact our social systems.
I think that's a very profound insight. So if, for example, you brought a patient into the courtroom and you showed that he had lost his orbital frontal cortex, there's no question you'd feel differently about his consciously doing something under his own control than if he had a normal brain.
So I actually was asked, a journalist called me and asked me a question about this. So one of the things we know about brain development is that the frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to be fully mature. And so in adolescence, the frontal cortex is known to be immature. And so this journalist called me up and said, do you believe that because the frontal cortex develops late, that teenagers should not be responsible for their actions because they have improperly developed frontal cortex? To which my response was, are you out of your mind? They're teenagers. Why do you need to know about the frontal cortex? Of course they, you know. So I mean, the discourse has moved from the domain that we all understand, which is that adolescents do adolescent things, into this sort of dressed-up version of neuroscience, which I think does not serve our society or our community well.
This has been exciting to me, the deciding brain, and just the idea of the kinds of things that we talk about at this table and all the decisions that are made. I mean, for example, here, just an interesting thing, I had a conversation at this table before we taped this program with President Carter, former President Carter, and the decision he made as to what to do about the hostages, you know, and what process of decision-making might have led him to make a different decision.
Affected his whole presidency.
And it affected his presidency, but it would have affected lives. And what would be the decision you make about the response if, in fact, you said to the Iranians at that time, we're going to do this, if you don't do this, or we're going to do this twice if you don't do this, and that whole kind of thing with enormous consequences, and just beginning to understand that. Is it possible that we can make smarter decisions?
It's a lot like the trolley problem.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
What's going on in the hostage
exactly
cases?
What it is.
Because what you're saying is, if we negotiate to try to save these people, then all the future hostages, more of them will be taken, and they'll be in greater danger.
Right.
Well, when you say I'm not going to negotiate, what you're really doing is pushing somebody in front of the trolley in the name of the greater good.
No, exactly.
And so that's a beautiful example of how these toy little kinds of philosophical fruit flies that we can use in the lab can actually apply to real serious issues out in the wider world.
I think what is also emerging is the time scale, and you're referring to that. When neuroscience moves into decision making, it's moving into a deep body of knowledge, and it's going to be a long time before it makes the kind of impact it's capable of making. But there's a systematic and very encouraging beginning, and this is what these people have outlined for us.
Okay, so this is the deciding brain. What will we do next month?
Well, this is the first step showing how neuroscience can have an impact in other areas of knowledge. Next month, we're going to consider what neuroscience can contribute to creativity. We're going to consider art and what we can contribute to understanding that. And we're going to have Richard Serra and Chuck Close, two of the most important artists of the last 50 years, and try to see whether they can explain to us aspects of their creativity in addition to showing us their beautiful work. So we'll continue to have a great time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you here.